Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have happened. Matthew chapter 34, verse 24. This verse has been heavily scrutinized by skeptics, mainly because it is a prophecy, and as a prophecy, it foretells things that will happen, and if these things don't happen, then you begin to start questioning the prophet. However, what Jesus means by a couple of things here is up for debate, because it's not entirely clear. But let's analyze a little deeper. First of all, the main debate is around what Jesus means by this generation. Is he talking about the generation he's speaking to, or is he referring to the generation he's talking about within the prophecy? This is an excellent question, so let's dive in a little deeper. First of all, this is at the end of the prophecy. Jesus foretells the end times and his second coming. He says some of the signs are false prophets, war and suffering, the gospel spreading to all the nations, and the sounding of heavenly trumpets. Then he says this generation will not pass away until all those things have happened. However, since 30 AD, these things have not happened. So what did Jesus mean by this? Was he a liar? Was it metaphor? Or was it genuinely just a prophecy that hasn't come true yet? I partially agree with this scrutiny. It is rightful scrutiny, because we have to look into what Jesus means. Clearly, the generation he said this generation to passed away almost 2,000 years ago. So how does this make sense? Well, there are two possible interpretations that both have a lot of merit to them. The first interpretation is that Jesus is foretelling the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. Now you might say, well, how can you have all these signs then, the heavenly trumpets, the false prophets? Well, this is called apocalyptic language. This is language that depicts the end of the world, the end of all time, so to speak. War and suffering, false prophets, etc. In fact, it's noteworthy that Isaiah uses this same exact apocalyptic language in metaphor to describe and foretell the destruction of Babylon. What Isaiah and Jesus both have in common is that they say the sun and the moon will both lose their light. This is a metaphor that is common between the two of them, so therefore it is not far-fetched to imply that perhaps Jesus was just using this kind of imagery to paint a metaphor of the destruction of the temple, which in fact did happen. So if that's what Jesus were talking about, that prophecy would have been fulfilled. So if this interpretation is correct, that means Jesus was correct, the prophecy is true, and he did foretell actual events that happened before the generation he was speaking to passed away. So that gives Jesus a lot of credibility. However, what if it's not that? What if it's another interpretation? What if it's actually of the end times? If Jesus actually is talking about the end times, he says, surely this generation will not pass away. So what does he mean by this? Well, it's actually a pretty basic literary interpretation. He's just talking about a prophecy, and this generation means the generation he's talking about within that prophecy. So to put it simply, Jesus is not talking about the generation he's directly speaking to, being his disciples. He is instead, more accurately, speaking about the generation that witnesses the signs that he's telling, the generation that sees a false prophet come forward, the generation that hears the heavenly trumpets, the generation that endures all this war and suffering that he foretells. This makes a lot of sense, because he lists all the signs that have not happened yet in his time, and then he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. So once one sign happens, the rest are sure to follow, and then the second coming of Christ is shortly after. He's using descriptive language to say that once these signs are witnessed, the second coming of Christ is very near. So either of those two interpretations, although only one can technically be correct, it doesn't mean that Jesus is wrong just because they can be interpreted differently. He did actually mean something, we just can't be 1000% sure what it is. But regardless of which way you take it, if it was an actual prophecy, or if it was simply him talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, both of them are unable to prove him wrong or a false prophet. Jesus never really gives a false prophecy, because the way you look at it has to be different. If he's talking about the temple, it actually did come true. If he's talking about future events, it hasn't come true yet, but that doesn't mean he's wrong. But if you interpret it in such a way that he's saying the generation he's talking to now will experience the trumpets, will experience the war and the suffering, will experience a false prophet, then obviously Jesus was not telling the truth. However, it seems extremely unlikely that that's the case, especially because Jesus was known to be cryptic, speak in metaphors, and speak in parables. So Jesus probably knew that this interpretation would not be so clear. However, Jesus gave us free will, and that means we can decide whether or not we read into his teachings or we just pass them off and weaponize them against the faith. The choice is yours. However, be honest with yourself, and more importantly, be intellectually honest with approaching this prophecy. You have more options of interpretation where Jesus is correct, or at least not a liar, than you do if he is. And when you take into account all of his other perfect teachings, he would be a complete hypocrite if he foretold something that actually wasn't true. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to say Jesus was lying about this and that his prophecy was wrong. Because why come for 30 years and then say within the next 40 years before this generation passes away, I will come back again and save everybody? God sent his only son to die for the world. So wouldn't he allow longer than, say, 40 years? That's a blink of an eye for God. It makes more sense that these years would happen thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years after Christ's coming. Now, I lean towards the prophetic interpretation because it seems explicitly clear that Jesus is describing specific real events, like the coming of the wicked one that we see in Paul's letters, or the sounding of the trumpets that we see in Revelation. He's specifically mentioning things and prophecies that are foretold to happen before the end of the world and before the second coming of Christ. That being said, are you ready? Or are you still rejecting God? Whatever the case may be, look into the Gospels, analyze Jesus' teachings, recognize that he was perfect, and that if you're completely honest with yourself and you use your free will in a positive way, Jesus is the way to life. So don't flip the word on its head to weaponize it against Christians, because it doesn't work. Thanks for watching. Follow the call to Christ, defend the faith, and God bless.